Thank you everyone for coming. So I want to start out with a story. I want to tell you guys about something that happened to me a little bit ago when I was interviewing for a company. I was in a state of mind that a lot of interviewees are in about wanting to learn more about this company and how things are done, engineering-wise. So I'm in the interview and everything is going really great. And I'm answering all the questions correctly and I feel really good. And then the interviewer turned to me at the end of the interview and he said, "Do you have any questions? I want to know what you think. Like, tell me, ask me your questions." So I turned to the interviewer and I said, "Who's responsible for your testing environment? And how often do you deploy production data to staging? And tell me about the development life cycle." And he stopped me and he said, "They don't have a testing environment, they test in production." I know. If my slide would work. I know, a little delayed. Right? Come again? I was so confused. Like, what do you mean you test in production? People don't do that. All right, I think I'm not going to use this clicker. There we go. So after he could see that I was like completely confused, I was shocked. Like, what do you mean people don't do this? So then he had me do something, and I want you guys to do it with me right now. He said, "Talia, think about the last feature that your team deployed." So I want everyone to think about the last feature that your team deployed. Okay? Thinking about it? Is it working? Right now? In production? How do you know? Your users haven't reported anything to you, your PagerDuty alarms haven't gone off, so you assume that it works, right? But you don't know. Testing in production is the only way to know that your features are working right now in production. So what is testing in production? It means testing your features in the environments that your features will live in. It means testing your features in the place that your users will interact with those features. And it means not using a dummy environment like staging or a QA environment. It means testing your features in the environments where your users will interact with those features. What is it not? It is not a replacement for all of your testing, and it's not the end of the world. Hi guys, I'm Talia. I'm a software engineer and test at WeWork. I'm the founder of Women Who Test Tel Aviv. It's a community group for women engineers who are interested in testing in Tel Aviv. I'm a testing and prod skeptic to practitioner. My superpowers are turning product requirements into test cases, breaking features prior to launch, but my favorite thing to do at work is to test my coworkers. What do I mean by testing my coworkers? I like to test their reactions to things that I think are funny when it's their birthday or they're on vacation. Anyone here a Warriors fan? No? Okay, I know we're really far from California. Okay, so after the interview, I went home and I did my homework. Why have I never heard about testing in production before? And if it's such a great thing, why aren't more companies implementing it? So most companies, and all the companies that I've worked for before, they all use a test environment, right? So raise your hand if you use a testing environment, any sort of staging environment, QA environment. Okay, great. Now keep your hand up if your test environment is absolutely perfect. It's an exact replica of your production environment. One person, I don't believe you. All right, so through my experience, testing in a staging environment really isn't ideal, right? It's really not a replica of production, and I'm going to go into that. So what's wrong with staging environments? Staging environments are expensive to maintain, so companies spend millions and millions of dollars every year to create and maintain their staging environments. Staging test results do not always match production test results. So think about a time where you tested a feature inside and out. You went through all of the requirements, you tested every single test case. You feel so good about this feature, you nailed it. You went through all the requirements with your product owner. You feel so good, you tested it, it looks great. And then you deploy to production, and what happens? There's a bug, right? So the data in staging does not match the data in production, therefore the test results are not always going to match. So production includes data that staging doesn't have. Now you're never going to know the differences between staging and production until you test in production. No one cares if staging is broken. Oh my god. Yeah, this stage is broken, right? Thank you, sorry about that. All right, clicker doesn't work, this thing falls over, everything's great, guys. Okay, so no one cares if staging is broken, right? So picture this, you're testing a really high priority feature, and it's the day before it's supposed to go out, and you are really nervous, and you log into staging to fix it, but staging is down, you get the 404 screen of death, and you ping the IT guy, but he's in a different time zone, so you have to wait until he wakes up, and then you ping him when he's awake, and then he tells you he's at lunch, so you have to ping someone else, and then you ping that person, and they say you have to open a ticket, and then you open a ticket, but the ticket has to be approved by your manager. No one cares if staging is broken. It's not a priority. No one's going to get a call in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner because staging is down. No one cares. Okay, so the load in production does not match staging. So think of all of the people who use your staging environment and all the people who use your production environment. That difference is really big. So there's no way to get performance data from staging. You have to do it in production. And at the end of the day, I've never heard anyone speak highly of their staging environment. But I know what you're thinking. Like, that's nice, Talia. Testing in production is great, but I can't do it. And, my staging environment sucks too, but I have to deal with it, right? I used to think this too, but the good news is that you already do it, right? So what's the first thing you do right after you deploy a feature? You go to production and you test it, right? Okay, here's the thing. Testing in production only works when the whole team owns product quality. So contrary to popular belief, it's not the test engineer's job, the software developer in test, the quality engineer, all the names for the position that I have. It's not the test engineer's job to ensure product quality. It's the entire team's job. Testing in production only works when you test early and often. So having your tests run incrementally every hour, every couple hours, whatever you decide is really important, because the earlier you find bugs and defects, the earlier they'll be fixed, and the earlier you'll be providing a better user experience for your users. Testing in production only works when you trust your team and your product. So I learned that what stops most companies from testing in production is fear. They're too afraid of the risks, and they don't have trust in their systems. So think about it. Companies don't test in production because of this fear and this lack of trust in their systems, and for the same reason, they refuse to engage in the tools and process changes that will generate that trust. I know it's risky. I know there's risks to this process, but let's go through them. So some of the risks are that it can affect real end users, right? So if your test entities interact with production entities rather than actual test entities, like, you're going to be in trouble. It can affect reporting and analytics, which can affect business decisions. So when you're testing in production, you're performing real actions in your production environment. And you need a way to differentiate between real data and production data, right? Because these users' actions, you don't want those to be filtered into your reporting. You only want, like, real production people to be included inside any of your data, any of your reporting, right? Because you don't want to make business decisions based on what your robots are doing. You want to make business decisions based on what real people are doing, right? Okay, it can affect third parties that your software is integrated with. So if you're testing in production with third parties, you need to make sure that you have a way to differentiate between test data and real data, so that test data does not get processed with your third party. This goes for things like emails and things like any sort of processing with data that goes into any sort of third party. This is going to be a problem if you're testing in production. You need to know how to handle it. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to do this safely, and we're going to address all the risks together, because I know that you're dying to know. Okay, so the first step when you're testing in production is to make sure you have all of the necessary tools. And the first tool that's really essential when you're testing in prod is feature flagging. And feature flagging is a way to decide who sees which features at runtime. So you can either hide, enable, or disable a feature. during runtime, and it's specifically per feature. Okay, so this is kind of how I see feature flagging. So here's what we did. Each feature would be written by a developer and launched into a feature flag, and all of the members of our team would be targeted in that flag. And therefore, only we would be able to see that changes. So all of these green people up here, there are production users, there are real end users. They won't see anything related to this feature because they're not in the feature flag, they're not targeted. Only the people who are targeted, only us as a development team can see anything related to this feature. And the feature flag would stay turned off until the feature was ready to launch. And it was in this time where we as test engineers went in and started testing. So we tested all the requirements, we opened any defects that were found, we wrote all of our automation scripts, we basically validated all of the functionality while the feature flag was off, and while we were the only ones who were targeted in that feature flag. So if there were bugs in our new feature, only we would see them. The outside world could not see anything related to the bug, couldn't see anything related to this feature, right? So no end users were affected because they can't see the feature. Now the bugs were fixed before the feature flag was turned on and before the user ever saw anything wrong. So we also created test users and put those into our feature flag. I'm going to come back to this. This is really important for automation, so I just wanted to point that out here. So once we fixed all the bugs and we fixed all the defects, we turned on our feature flag already knowing that we didn't break anything else. We tested everything while the feature flag was off. Our automation scripts will then continue to run in production so that if anything ever did happen in the future, we would have this off button, we would get alerted, we would figure out what was going on, and then we would turn the feature flag back on. So we would have this sort of safety net, this feature flag, that would allow for, if anything ever happened in the future, you know, we have this feature flag that if something did go wrong, we could turn it off. So we would then repeat this process for every new feature. And this allowed us to have a safe way of testing in production without affecting real end users. So it can be a lot when you have so many feature flags, right? If you think of like really big companies, you have a lot of features. What happens when you have a ton of parallel feature flags? It's impossible to test all of them, right? So it is impossible to test every single combination of every feature flag, especially when you are a big company. So my advice is to choose the most important flows to automate and work with your product owner to figure out what are the most important things for your business that you really need to test, what are the most common combinations of feature flags that people use, and start with those. So you created the feature flag, you turned it on for everyone, and everything looks good, you didn't break anything. So now what happens? It's been a while and everything looks really good. So what happens to the old code, the code that was there before the feature flag? That should be removed, right? That's old code. You need to maintain your code base. That old code should not be there anymore. And after the feature flag is on, after you validate everything is working, you can delete that feature flag too. So you need to maintain both your feature flag, your feature flags and your code base to be up to date. You don't want old and stale code in your code base. So I'm just going to show you guys how to do this in Split. Split is a tool that I have used for feature flagging. So in the UI, you're going to click a button. It's called Create Split. And the first thing you do after you come up with a name for your feature flag is to figure out what your traffic type is. So who do you want to see this feature? You can differentiate between what type of device, like only people who have an Android device can see this feature, only people who have an iPhone can see this feature. You can decide if you want to do it by device, by user. I like to do it by user so that like my team can test and then deploy it. You can do it by location. There's all this different traffic type on the Split interface. So after you select a traffic type, you're going to create your targeting rules. So this is where you specifically say, who do you want to see this feature? So here I'm going to say only the people in my development team can see this feature. And notice that I also put an automation bot inside of the feature flag. And this is the bot that was in the feature flag in my diagram before, and I'm going to go over this later when I talk about automation. So you can see that the default is off. The default rule is off, which means that people in the outside world, if your name is not on this list, if your email address is not on this list, that you can't see anything related to this feature. Okay, so now in the code I can say if this really cool feature flag is on for this person, do this action. If not, you're going to do something else, right? So this would only work, the really cool feature would only be on for the people who are in that feature flag. And then the script is set up at the same time, and the test is going to say log in with that robot, with that user that you put in the feature flag, do some actions, click some buttons, do some things, and then make sure that that really cool feature works. And these automation scripts are on before the users are able to interact with our feature. So these would run, and then if something broke, if the test failed, we would be the ones to see something that was wrong. Our users wouldn't see that. Okay, so the best part about this, the cherry on top of the cake, was that when we turned on the feature flag, we already knew on 100% that our features were working in production, and there were no surprises. Okay, so the next thing you're going to need when you're testing in production is an automation framework. Why do you need an automation framework when you're testing in production? Because it's not scalable to manually test every single feature after you deploy it. Trust me, I've tried. Okay, so you're going to want an automation framework that's easy to adopt. So something, if you are trying to onboard your developers or you're trying to onboard other people to, that it doesn't take an arm and a leg to get them to use it. So something that's really easy to adopt. Something that's easy to debug. When something goes wrong, how do you fix it? What happens? One that has good reporting. So when a test fails, you need to know immediately what happened. Something that has really good reporting. Something that has a good support community. So you don't want to use an automation tool that doesn't have a good support community, because if something happens, you don't know how to write a certain part of your test, or something happens with your test that you don't know what to do, you need to have a community to reach out to, and you don't want to be stuck, because being stuck in that kind of situation is a pretty tricky situation. Okay, the next thing you're going to want is a job scheduler. So you want to know as often as possible that your features are working, right? So when you're making this decision, think about the longest time you'd want to know that a critical flow is failing. You can also have two groups of tests. One group of critical tests that runs every hour, every 2 hours, whatever. And then you can have another group of less critical tests that runs once a day, twice a day. Okay, so why not just run the tests in a loop? You want to pick a cadence that strikes a good balance between how fast you want to know something's wrong versus how much additional load and cost you want to put on a system. So running the tests in a loop continuously is overkill, right? You need to trust your tests. You can also set up the test to run in your build pipeline. That's another option. But you really want to trust your tests. So something that I like to do before I push up a test is to watch them run in production. So I'll set it up on my machine so that the tests will hit production. And I'll watch them run, and I'll make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. And that way I have confidence. I know that it's doing what it's supposed to do, and then I'll push it up to production, and I'll know that my tests are working. Okay, so you need some sort of alerting tool that alerts you when a test fails in production. So remember what I said before is that everyone on the team owns product quality. So you want to choose an alerting tool that can be integrated with your job scheduler so that if a test fails, someone gets alerted and they're on it. And you need to have a rotation of who's on call to handle alerts. So that means your developer, your product person, your designer, your engineering manager, all of your engineers, everyone needs to be included in this process because everyone owns product quality. Okay, so these are some of the tools that I've used for testing in production. For feature flagging, I've used Launch Darkly and Split. Those are both tools that are really easy to use. The Launch Darkly interface is really similar to Split. For automation, I've used Robot Framework, Puppeteer with Jest, and Protractor. And for a job scheduler, I've used Jenkins and CircleCI. For alerting, I've used PagerDuty and Slack. So these are some of the tools that I've used. Like, I'm sure there's other ones that work just as well, but I'm comfortable recommending these. Okay, So after you install your necessary tools, the next thing you have to do is carefully create your test data, right? Okay, so the problem is you need a way to create and manipulate test data in production without affecting real end users or any data and analytics, right? Okay, so there's two solutions for this. The first is to create a consistent naming convention for your test users. So if the email address of this user contains a certain string, we would know that this is a test user, and we would know to exclude this from all of our analytics. So these users acted like real people, and they looked like real people on the site, and they performed all the same actions that our end users did, but because they were named a certain way, we knew that they were robots. And these were the robots that were targeted in the feature flags for our automation. So the next thing you can do, if you don't want a specific naming convention, you could have just a simple Boolean. So something like is test user, and have it default to be off for your normal production users, and for your robots, have that default be on. We also had a back-end flagging system to identify all of our test entities. So if this flag went on, then that thing would automatically be excluded from reporting, from all of our reporting. So think of things like your test shopping cart, your test group, your test web page, all this stuff that's in production that is separate from things that your end users are going to interact with. They need to have some sort of flag, some sort of flag that will tell you that this is a testing entity. Okay, so each company and each product in the world has their own testing entities, and you guys have to decide within your company what do you need to flag, right? So you need to make sure that your testing entities only interact with each other. And this is really at the base of what allowed us to make sure that what we were doing was not interacting with anything that our users were doing, because in our scripts we would say log in as this specific test user, click on this specific testing entity, do this specific testing thing, and if that didn't pass, then the test wouldn't go on. So there was no way that it could click on something that was in production that it was not supposed to click on. And we were able to create and manipulate testing entities in production by following these specific predetermined guidelines. So again, your team has to decide what these guidelines are going to be for your team. Okay, so the next step after your setup and creation of your test data is to write your tests. Okay, so to write our tests, I like to use BDD. It's really easy to debug when something goes wrong, when you have like really simple given when then. This is Robot Framework, which I love. But whether or not you use BDD, you need to know as early as possible that something goes wrong. And when something goes wrong, you need to know what's happening as fast as possible. So some of these like complex automation tools, when you write a test, it's really hard to figure out what the test is doing, what went wrong, if a test fails, like what exactly is happening. That's really not okay when you're testing in production. You need to know what's happening, why did it happen, and debug as fast as possible, as soon as possible. Okay, so setup and teardown when you're testing in production, I think is more important than the test itself. So when you're setting up a test to run in production, this is pretty simple, like clear cookies, log in, start from scratch, start from 0. And then after every test, you want to undo any actions that the test performed. So if you think of all of the actions that the test performed, so validating whatever functionality, in the teardown you need to make sure that this is your cleanup time. This is the time where you undo anything that your test did. This is really important, the teardown, because if any step of this process fails, whether it's the setup or the test or the teardown, you need to get alerted immediately and the test needs to stop. So something that I see a lot of the times is that alerting is set up just for the test and not for the setup or the teardown. And that causes problems because what if you create this testing thing in production and the teardown is supposed to remove that thing and it doesn't remove that thing, and an end user goes in and sees that thing, that's it's going to create confusion. It's not a great user experience. So if any part of that testing the testing process fails, you need to be alerted and you need to be on it. Okay, so the next thing is to deploy to a production canary. What is a production canary? It's when you slowly roll out a change to a small subset of users before you roll it out to your entire code base, and it minimizes the impact if something goes wrong. So why should we use a production canary? What's the benefit? Why should we use it? Canary launches provide risk mitigation. So if something happened in your feature flagging process and you deployed something to production and there was a bug and you didn't catch it, you deployed a bug because something happened in the process, someone missed something, there was something with the requirements, whatever, you deployed a bug. So do you want 100% of your users to encounter this issue, or do you want 1% of your users to encounter this issue? So using a production canary allows you to quickly identify the issue, roll back easily to a good version, and then fix the issue in a controlled environment. And this works really well for infrastructure and configuration changes. That's how I suggest when you're testing infrastructure changes and configuration changes in production, I would really suggest using a production canary. Okay, so when you're setting up your canary, the UI is really simple. There's kind of this like sliding bar in both Split and Netlify. You can allocate traffic to a specific percentage of users that you want to be exposed to this feature. Very simple UI. So what if there's an issue with your canary code? The first thing you're going to want to do is figure out what's going on. Analyze the issue. Ask yourself, is it okay if my users see this? Is this a priority 1 issue, or is this not a priority at all and we don't care? So if it's not okay that your users see this feature, return the canary to 0% traffic and fix the bug. Really simple. And if it is okay that your users see this feature, see this bug, it's not a high priority thing, it's okay, then you can just keep the canary as is and fix the bug. Okay, so to summarize, for risk mitigation, before you launch, use feature flagging to target users, and after launch, use production canaries to limit your audience in case something goes wrong. Okay, so the outcome of this process was really outstanding. So our entire team, from developers to product to testers to our engineering managers, everyone knew and everyone had complete confidence in each of our releases because we knew ahead of time that our features were working in the environments that they will live in. So we also increased developer velocity because our developers spent less time fixing bugs and more time creating value for our users. So without testing in production, we would have been reactive as opposed to proactive. So I don't want to wait for something to go wrong, someone to report it to my team, and then have someone say, hey, did you hear about this bug? No, I want to fix it before anyone ever knows anything is wrong, right? So this is a really great way to be proactive rather than reactive. So when something went wrong or when something broke, our tests would fail. We would immediately get alerted, and by immediately get alerted, I mean everyone on the team, whoever was on call. We would analyze what was going on and we would resolve it as soon as possible. Now what this would do is it would minimize the user interaction with bugs and defects, and it really ensured a great user experience for everyone because that pressure of knowing if your feature is going to work in production is off. Okay, so just a note about performance testing in production. Yes, it is possible. You want to do it at a time with low traffic and be prepared for outages. It's better to do this on purpose and be on call and control the outcome rather than it happen to you and not know what to do. Okay, so when you're testing in production with third parties, you want to work with them to be able to identify test data and real data. So something that I've done in the past that works really well is to take your API request, add a header that says this is test data, and you can set up this header in your API request so that everyone who is interacting with your third party and your product knew that this is test data. So with this header, we would send it to our third party and say, okay, we're going to send you a request with this header, and if it has this header, it's, don't process it, and if it doesn't have this header, it's real data and you need to process it. Okay, so what if I can't test in production? I work for a bank, or I work for a hospital, or something that affects human lives, and I really can't test in production. What do I do? So something that you can do is spin up a containerized environment per build. So you can use Docker to spin up your microservices, but remember, the more dependencies, the more complicated. When you're testing in a containerized environment, you need to know which version of Docker will be used in production and test against those versions. You also need to run separate tests for each individual microservice as well as all of them together. And hackers are targeting these systems that are hosted in these containers that are not secured properly. There's a lot of information about this online where I see people are getting into these containers because they're not secure. So it's also very, very expensive. If you think about each time someone will pull up this environment and then multiply that by X amount of developers, it gets very, very expensive. So testing in a containerized environment, it's still good, but just not as good. Okay, now what about other non-production tests? So staging environments can still be used for pre-production testing, and this is really important for financial systems that abide by SOX compliance. And these should be tested ahead of time and not in production. So anything that has to do with privacy-related issues and data-sensitive information, these should be tested here to minimize data breaches. Now, where do prod tests operate? So if you think of a bubble of all of our tests, and inside of that bubble you have your end-to-end flows, and within those end-to-end flows you have your production tests. So you can see that not all production tests are end-to-end tests because of these data privacy-related issues. You can see that there's other tests that are end-to-end tests that will run in other places because it's just not possible, because there's data-sensitive information or whatever it is. Okay, let's talk about shifting your company's testing culture. This is one of the hardest parts about testing in production, especially in the beginning. So somewhere that I would start is to explain why the pros outweigh the cons for your company. So is your staging environment reliable? And besides the one person in the back, it's not reliable for any of you. So are there frequently issues that you think could have been caught if you were testing in production? Use examples from the past. So do you remember when we merged XYZ and it caused this huge issue in production? Do you think if we tested XYZ in production that issue could have been caught? Do you remember when we tested XYZ inside and out in staging and it was perfect in staging, and then we deployed to production and it broke? Propose a path forward. So you can't just go to management with a problem, right? You have to go to them with a problem and a solution. So have you heard about this thing called feature flagging? Talk to your manager, talk to your team. Can I take some time in the next sprint to see if we could benefit from it, to see if it would work? If we were to start testing in production, which flows do you think would bring us the most value? So we used to be scared of deploying new features. We used to fight about whether or not to deploy code on Fridays, but we don't fight about that anymore. We fight about other things. Once we started moving more and more code to testing in production, this fear and these arguments stopped. And the lead time to know if something was wrong was reduced, and therefore the confidence in our releases increased. Okay, so there's always going to be those people who say testing in production will never work. And to those people, I say three things. Number one, staging will never fully represent production. Number two, staging is a sunk cost. And number three, they're not my target audience. They'll either get on board or die off. Not die, die off. Okay, so if you want to try it, I suggest these 6 steps. So you're going to want to install your tools, install your feature flagging, your automation framework, your job scheduler, your alerting tool. Create your test data and make sure your testing entities only interact with your other testing entities. Write your tests and make sure that your teardown cleans up your test and that you get alerted for each part of the testing process, so setup, testing, and teardown. Launch your feature behind a feature flag, deploy to a production canary, and have a drink. Okay, so if you weren't paying attention at all for the past 40 minutes, I want you to take away two things. Number one, no one cares if your feature is working in production. No one cares if your feature is working in staging. We care if it works in production. Number two, the only way to know if it's working in production is to test it in production. And that's all, folks.